Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today we are talking to Elizabeth Dickinson, a senior analyst for the Arabian Peninsula at the International Crisis Group. It's good to have you on the show, Elizabeth.
Thanks for having me.
Today we're going to be talking about Yemen, sort of the latest, the reports of an Emirati drawdown, and perhaps what all this means looking forward for the future of the conflict and why it matters for the United States and the regional partners. So I thought it would start just with the way to start for people who don't follow this conflict in as close a detail as you is just giving a general update of what's been going on and where the parties stand as of today.
Great. So just to sort of do a quick recap, this conflict began in 2015, more or less, when Saudi Arabia and a coalition of countries, the most important of which was the United Arab Emirates, entered the conflict to try to push back the Houthi rebel movement, which had sort of swept from its home in the north of the country all across Yemen and controlled much of the territory, including the capital, Sana'a. So that conflict began in 2015. The Saudis focused largely on an air campaign, trying to roll back the Houthi presence. The United Arab Emirates focused on a joint air campaign and also boots on the ground approach, particularly in the southern and western theaters. So fast forward to late last year, the conflict had essentially stalemated, and we had reached a point where particularly the UAE, because it was expending a great deal of resources and manpower and capabilities to sort of uphold its part in the conflict, was growing impatient with this stalemate and was seeking ways to move it sort of in a new direction, ideally towards peace talks, but essentially in any way that could shift the conflict such that they would be able to eventually extricate themselves from it. So late in 2018, they pitched the battle for the port city of Hodeidah on the Red Sea coast as sort of a way to shift the balance of power. The Houthis had controlled this very key port city, the largest port in Yemen, the one where the majority of food and humanitarian goods enter. The UAE reasoned that if their aligned forces on the ground were able to take it, it would sort of push the Houthis towards negotiation. Now, a lot of organizations, including Crisis Group, warned that if this happened, it would be a massive humanitarian crisis. And so there was a major international effort to avert that battle for Hodeidah. And the result of that really was the Stockholm Agreement. After 3 weeks of talks between the government of Yemen and the Houthi rebels in Sweden, they were able to come up with a way to sort of de-escalate around this port city. So they signed the agreement. There's, everyone is excited about sort of the chance that, maybe this is going to be an opening to really wind down the conflict, open up a political solution. But then 2019 hits and it all gets stuck. So the agreement that was reached was quite broad, and immediately the two sides sort of began to bicker over the details, sort of, this line means this line means this, and sort of different interpretations of what the agreement actually meant. They really struggled, the UN particularly, to sort of get momentum in implementation and sort of some steps on the ground to continue to boost trust between the parties. And as a result of that non-action, I think the trust really deteriorated throughout early 2019 until we got to really a sort of another stuck moment in the conflict a few months ago. So the UAE, again, sort of trying to use whatever ways they could to sort of shift the momentum, really looked for ways, first of all, to implement the Stockholm Agreement, and second of all, to sort of just shake things up. And I think the drawdown is very much a part of that effort. There has been some minor progress in implementing the Stockholm Agreement and sort of getting the UN into the port in Hodeidah. But by and large, this is really just a way for the UAE to achieve its main objective, which has been the same for the last several years, which is to get out of this conflict. And so what they're doing now is sort of a drawdown of the majority of their troops along the Red Sea coast and in the southern theater. They're hoping to remain on maybe about sort of, let's say, 25 to 50% of that force on the ground in sort of an advise and assist capacity. but the majority of forces will be drawing down and handing over operations to Yemeni partners. So this is a really interesting juncture for the conflict. I think the UAE had hoped that it would move things again towards political talks, but that really has unfortunately become a bit unlikely at the moment because of the regional situation and particularly tensions with Iran. Just as a sort of reminder of the geopolitics of Yemen, one of the things that makes the Houthi rebels very disfavorable to the Saudis and their coalition partners is this nascent alliance that they have forged with Iran that has grown throughout the conflict. So in the eyes of many Saudi policymakers, the Houthi rebels really are sort of an Iranian proxy in the region. And so anytime that tensions between the US and Iran or the Saudis and Iran escalate, it has a direct impact on the conflict in Yemen. And I think at the moment, the major risk is that the conflict just sort of slips into this international tension and really stagnates once again.
I'm curious, how the Emirati position on the war has shifted. It's obviously, I think, been going on longer than either of the two major co-combatants, the Saudis and the Emiratis, thought it would be at the beginning of this war. I mean, would it be fair to characterize that they were surprised that they weren't able to make rapid progress, or were they expecting sort of a more stalemated, slow type of campaign, and therefore have been looking for an exit almost as fast as they got into this conflict?
It's a very good question. And I think one of the important things to understand about the Emirati engagement in Yemen is that it's always sort of been bifurcated into two buckets. So the first bucket really has been this coalition effort with the Saudis to push back the Houthis. But the other bucket has been sort of counterterrorism and operations that are trying to push back Islamist and political Islamist groups in the south of Yemen. So this is everyone ranging from the Muslim Brotherhood to Al-Qaeda. So the first fight, the one against the Houthis, they're really in that to support their partners. And I think their patience with that conflict really was, I think, proved. I didn't think they expected it to drag on as long as anticipated. And again, beginning about a year and a half ago, they really decided that it was time to find an exit strategy. The other fight, however, is one that they feel sort of is more in their direct, immediate interest, and are sort of committed to staying basically as long as it takes. And what that will look like, I think, will change over time. But essentially, they're planning to sort of keep a presence in southern Yemen and keep up this anti-Islamist fight for the long term. In terms of, it's interesting because although the tactics have shifted very dramatically, I actually think that the Emirati objective vis-a-vis the Houthi part of the conflict has been pretty uniform throughout, which is to do as much as possible to push the Houthis back, but then eventually sort of find a way to wind down involvement and hand it really back over to the Saudis, who are the ones that have a direct domestic and existential interest in solving this conflict.
Yeah, no, it's curious, and one could perhaps infer that they don't share exactly, the Saudis and the Emiratis don't share absolutely overlapping positions in this conflict vis-a-vis Iran, how they view Iran in the region. And I think, linked to this, and something I'm curious to hear your thoughts about is, political positions and popular sentiment in the United States has shifted so hard against this war is that now there are active efforts to try and disentangle the U.S. from the Arab coalition. Are the Emiratis also looking west at like the tea leaves in Washington and trying to figure out a way to disentangle themselves or draw down in ways that are like most beneficial to their relationship with Washington?
I think that's definitely something that's on their radar and has been a part of their calculation, again, for some time. But they're worried about it in sort of two ways. I think they're, of course, worried about how it entangles themselves and sort of the direct impact on their reputation in Washington, but also, their ability to procure the latest American weapons and sort of the state of the art and continue very strong and close cooperation that they have with the Department of Defense and the intelligence community in the US. But I think the second way in which the congressional action has really caught their attention is the way that it puts pressure on Saudi Arabia. The United Arab Emirates has calculated that the transition in Saudi Arabia under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is sort of fundamentally in their interest. To get sort of more modernized, less oil dependent, more economically open. Saudi Arabia is something that they see as sort of vital to the long-term survival of their own country, which is much smaller and sitting literally right at the foot of Saudi Arabia. So they've sort of put all their eggs in this basket. And I think more than even worrying about themselves, I think they worry, what does this congressional pressure and the tension in the US mean for the stability of Saudi Arabia, which again is sort of an existential issue for them, to preserve this transition and to see it succeed. So I think in many ways it's caught the UAE's attention more than it has Riyadh's attention, because the stakes for them are they see in sort of, zero-sum terms, really.
Yeah, so now, we have the drawdown, or at least reports that it's beginning. And as you said, they're going to now focus more on advise and assist type missions with counterterrorism capacities, probably enabled and supported by the United States in certain levels, or at least supported, by the United States at some certain level. So where is this conflict going? I mean, if you look at Hodeidah, they haven't implemented Stockholm, as you said, but the battle lines, at least to me, appear to have hardened, and nobody is making tangible progress, but yet Saudi Arabia gets attacked quite frequently and the airstrikes continue. I mean, so where is the conflict going?
True, yeah. So I think there's two levels to this. And the first one is sort of the microdynamics inside Yemen, and the second is the regional tensions. So taking those sort of one at a time, the way that the UAE has managed their sort of geographical bit of the conflict has essentially been to organize and train Yemeni brigades of various regions and affiliations and persuasions to sort of fight behind the coalition. And so they've put them under a command and control structure that's quite organized, but sort of amongst themselves, each of the brigades is quite autonomous and has its own character and identity. So I think the immediate risk and sort of something that I think we should all be watching for in the coming months is how the UAE's departure impacts those dynamics between the groups that have been nominally all fighting on their side for the last few years. So, when the UAE has had a strong presence on the ground, they were relatively able to control these groups' movements, have everybody sort of on the same page, manage disputes. It was really sort of a relationship management question. And without their direct presence there, for sure, it will have an impact. I mean, they say that, of course, they maintain the relationships. They have sort of all the chains of contact are still intact, but it is different when you're not there on the ground. So this is definitely going to shift sort of the dynamics and really in some ways elevate and draw attention to the differing and particular goals and intentions of each of these different brigades that have been nominally fighting in the same direction. I think so that raises basically the risk of fragmentation overall. On the regional level, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just curious if you all had any semblance about the effectiveness of these brigades. It's always, when somebody's there, as you said, alongside of them, they perhaps overperform. When that person leaves, these brigades then begin to fissure. I mean, we've seen that in any type of militia building, United States, others, and I'm curious if not to interrupt you, but like if there's any sort of semblance of idea about what these brigades are capable of doing without the direct oversight from Emirati advisors.
It's a great question, and I think it's yet to be answered, and it's going to test the UAE in very new ways because they will try to remain in control of these groups, and I think it's an open question whether that will be effective. I think their sort of level of training and effectiveness varies quite a bit between brigades. Generally, though, what's the determinant of their effectiveness is their own personal interests. So if the objective at hand is something that is in their own interest, they have been relatively effective. What's harder is in cases where, for example, you ask, a brigade from one region to fight in a different region for something that they're maybe not so inclined to do or don't see the direct benefit to themselves. And again, when you had sort of Emirati command and control, you could motivate them in a different way, whether that's through sort of, camaraderie or support and supply or, ongoing training. And that will absolutely be harder from a remote context.
Yeah, and so, I mean, before we turn to sort of like the future here, I mean, how will this impact the Saudis? I mean, losing some portion of their closest partner in this fight has to have a net negative effect on their ability to continue this fight. I mean, or at least continue aspects of this fight, but perhaps not all of it. So how is Saudi Arabia viewing this? And what is the sort of the intra UAE Saudi dynamics as they portend to Yemen, and then looking forward into that future?
Yeah, I think that's sort of one of the key issues going forward, is sort of managing these dynamics. I think for sure this move limits the coalition's ability to achieve military victories. Bottom line, if yesterday they had 10 possibilities, today they have 2 or 3. And it's really going to make a major impact in sort of, I think, how the front lines shift or don't shift going forward. We have seen that Saudi Arabia has tried to sort of enter into the geographic territory of control that has traditionally been run operationally by the Emiratis. So there is an effort to sort of get the Saudis lined up to take over some of these responsibilities and sort of be there to pick up. But it's going to be very different. And frankly, it does mean that the Saudis are sort of more in it on their own. I think the UAE is happy to leave this fight without a win. And I don't think the same can be said without the Saudis. They are looking still for a win, something that sort of positions them in a with more bargaining power going into any potential negotiations to unwind the conflict. It's very hard to see how they're going to achieve that, because air power so far hasn't been able to achieve that for them, and it certainly won't be able to at this point when so many of the targets that were sort of, obvious hits have been struck, and when the Houthis have frankly developed quite a few more asymmetric capabilities that aren't as obviously targetable than initially, when they sort of were more reliant on ground operations. So, this could freeze the conflict. I think in the optimistic view, it could provide some space for negotiation, but really the key will be bringing the Saudis to a place where they are more comfortable to do that. And Crisis Group, I think, would argue that one of the major components of getting to that place is finding a solution to the cross-border activity, where you've seen Houthi drones and missiles entering Saudi Arabia on a very regular and intensifying basis. So I think one of the ideas that's floating around out there is, parallel to the sort of UN negotiations between the government of Yemen and the Houthis, you need to find a way to de-escalate between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia, whether that's directly, whether that's indirectly. There just has to be some sort of formula that brings the level of tension down so that trust can start to be built again. And really the Saudis have to be talked out of this idea that there is a military victory in Yemen. It sounds sort of repetitive, because this is the case that many people have been making to them for now going on 4 years, but there is no military win in this conflict. And I think the sooner that can be absorbed and sort of politically realized, the faster we can get back to the business of figuring out how to unwind this.
Don't you have to include Iran in that thing? Because, the Houthis aren't exactly firing indigenous weapons here.
So I think it's fair to say that Iran has been peripherally engaged in the process through interlocutors such as the Europeans. So, for example, the Iranians say that they were supportive of the Stockholm Agreement. I think the Europeans can do more to hold them accountable to that, what they've said about that. And going forward, they also have said that they're in favor of de-escalation in Yemen. So again, there are ways to sort of include them in the process without doing so formally in a way that is provocative to Saudi Arabia and the government of Yemen.
So, so this brings me like the final question, as we wrap up here is, one of the points of this podcast is to try and make everything relevant for U.S. foreign policy. Is there a role for the United States here, or is the role just is to sort of stay out of the way? As Crisis Group, or you personally, what is it that you envision as a U.S. role here, if at all?
The U.S. is so desperately needed to get the political process back on track. It has been remarkable how difficult it has been to bring the parties together when the U.S. is not engaged on this issue. One of the champions of the Sweden talks, who really was perhaps singularly the reason that an agreement was made in Stockholm, was former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis. His personal engagement made really a lot of difference in terms of, putting everyone on their same path, making sure everyone's rowing in the same direction, and really spearheading the momentum. There is no one doing that right now. And I have to say that that's really one of the key things that's missing. Without a sort of U.S. leadership on this issue, and without sort of frankly a point person within the US government who's empowered to take it on, it really has been challenging to get the Saudis back on board, to sort of bring the Saudis and the Emiratis on the same page, to bring the government of Yemen and Saudi Arabia on the same page. You really just need that unifying sort of driver in the front seat. And there aren't really any other candidates for it. The Europeans have tried, but they don't have the same sort of leverage, particularly with the coalition. I think, the Omanis have done wonderful work in sort of facilitating the Houthi side of the negotiations, but they don't have the same leverage, again, with the coalition. There's just no replacement for this U.S. leadership in the negotiation process. And short of that, I really do think that the UN will struggle to get things back on track.
In this context, does the congressional action help, or is it sort of a sideshow to just what you need to do is just to empower somebody within the United States, within the Trump administration, to basically take this thing head on?
I think it's very important in the sense that it's forcing the administration to pay attention to something that perhaps would otherwise be wrapped into the greater sort of countering Iran strategy. I mean, one of the challenges for U.S. policy at the moment, I think, is really differentiating and nuancing the situation in Yemen from this broader countering Iran maximum pressure strategy. The more that Yemen is wrapped into that regional strategy, the harder it's going to be to de-escalate this conflict and sort of unwind it. But if Congress can continue to provide an incentive for the administration to engage productively on Yemen and see it as a place where there really is possibility for progress, that's very helpful. I also do think that, there is a question about what is America's role in this conflict and what responsibility do we bear when our partners engage in activities that are not necessarily in line with U.S. interests. I think Yemen is sort of the latest in a long line of issues and conflicts that are reckoning with this question, but it's perhaps the most pronounced. And, to remind everyone, the conflict in Yemen has produced the single worst humanitarian crisis in the world from nothing. It's completely man-made. And of course, Yemen was poor before, but there's nothing to compare to the situation today. And yes, the U.S. has played a part of that, and its partners have been a part of that. And so dealing with that issue, I think publicly through congressional action and through, debates going into the primaries and the elections is very important to sort of open that question of what does it really mean when our partners engage in ways that we aren't comfortable with, but we're still supporting.
Elizabeth, this has been great. Thanks for coming on and going through this all with us and giving your thoughts on what the U.S. should do. I appreciate it.
Really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for listening.